Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over and our Storyented segment. According to his website, my next guest writes strange stories for strange children. His first novel, Peter Nimble and His Fantastic Eyes, was a Book Page magazine best book of 2011. His latest, Sophie Choir and the Last Story Guard, continues the adventures of Peter Nimble and introduces a new character, 12-year-old Sophie Choir. The book is all about the importance of stories and what happens when the nonsensical and the whimsical is outlawed or destroyed. To talk about his creative process and the importance of reading, I'm delighted to be joined by author and former yo-yo champion, Jonathan Auxier. Great to have you here, Jonathan.
It's great to be here.
I want to start with this particular book. Now, the title of the book is Sophie Choir and the Last Story Guard. It seems from reading your biography, and we've met once or twice, your parents are the real story guards here. Tell me about their particular love of reading and how they passed that on to you.
Well, that's a great question, and one I'm always excited to talk about because really my love of books and reading starts with the home that I grew up in. My parents were both very, very serious readers, and I grew up in a home that was just full of books. One of the things that was always very compelling to me is hearing my mother talk about her own journey as a reader. She grew up in a very isolated farm in North Dakota, and she grew up in a family that didn't really prioritize or value reading. And she was an avid and voracious and passionate reader, but she basically grew up in a community and an environment where books were extremely hard to come by. And sometimes when I was growing up, she would tell me about this moment that happened for her when she must have been about 14 or 15. And she had read systematically down the line every single novel in her little school's library. And she would talk about this moment when she got to the very last book. And I would hear her talk about that, and I can just imagine that feeling of, this is the last, this is the last book I'm going to read. This is the last chapter of the last book, the last page of the last book, and she had to finish the book, put it away, and kind of moved on with her life. And it wasn't until years later she was able to start building her own collection of books as a reader. And because of that, she always made sure our home was filled with books. And even when my family didn't have a lot of money, we had tons and tons of used, old, dusty books, which really instilled in me a love for old, tattered stories. And anytime my mother would tell me that story about being this girl who ran out of books, I always sort of imagined something in my head, a question, which is, what if that girl had found one more book? And what if that book was more than just a story?
Yeah, no, and of course, that is the germ of an idea that became, 20 years later, Sophie Choir. Tell me a little bit, and get into a little bit, in your biography, I've read where you were not a great reader. Your mother, in fact, pulled you out of school and homeschooled you to inculcate reading and encourage you to read.
That is true. Sometimes I feel a little bit like a hypocrite when I come out to schools and I talk to kids about reading, because I want to present myself as someone who was reading my whole life and really a sophisticated and advanced reader. And my whole life I knew how to read. I was a strong reader, if you tested me. But it took quite a few years for me to become a passionate reader. And one of the major steps in that journey was my mother discovering that even though I knew how to read in second grade, she could see very clearly that I didn't enjoy it. And she sort of hit the panic button and pulled me out of school for a year. And she homeschooled me. And so I took second grade twice. She never gave me a very good reason when I was a kid why she did that. And it was only later that I learned that the reason she did that is because I wasn't reading. And my homeschool curriculum was slightly unorthodox. It mainly consisted of drawing. She made me learn all of my prepositions for reasons I still don't fully understand. I memorized the presidents, all of whom I've forgotten. And then she made me read for 3 hours a day. And lo and behold, at the end of that year, when I went back into public school, I was the strongest reader, and I remember winning a reading competition, and it was that year that basically turned me into someone who could get excited about reading. And if she hadn't have done that, I really truly believe I would have been one of those kids who kind of fell through the cracks or just sort of sloughed his way through reading assignments. So I really credit that as one of the major pieces of intervention that helped turn me into a lifelong reader.
When I heard you speak at the Los Angeles Festival of Books, you talked about your reverence, really, of the classic children's books that have gone before all of us. And you can see little inspirations hidden in certain characters or stories in your books. The Night Gardener, you mentioned that book, which has it's a Victorian ghost tale. It's a fantastic book. But that Something Wicked This Way Comes sort of shaped that book. This Sophie Quire book you attribute to Alice in Wonderland as being an inspiration. Tell us a little about that and why the banishment of whimsy and nonsense is a theme that you explore in this book.
Well, those are two questions, and they're both very good ones. First, I'll talk a little bit about Alice. You know, if I'm giving my sort of biography of reading, another major moment in my life when books became just absolutely pivotal. I must have been about 10 or 11 years old, and it actually started in theater. And a lot of my love for storytelling started in theater. When I went and saw a live production of Alice in Wonderland. And my cousin happened to, she's an actress, and she happened to have been cast as Alice. She was an adolescent at that point. But she had been cast as Alice in this professional show. And because she was my cousin, she could get me comps. And we happened to be staying with them right at that time. And so I remember seeing the show 5 or 6 times in a row. And just, while falling down the rabbit hole, as it were, I became obsessed with the story Alice in Wonderland and the companion book Alice Through the Looking Glass. And for reasons that I do not fully understand as an adult now, I almost compulsively started reading that book. I had to read it every single night or read a couple chapters from it every night before I could go to sleep. It's odd because now I look back at the book and I can't quite find the appeal. But for some pivotal years, that book became absolutely vital. And so when I was trying to write a book in Sophie Quire, I'm trying to write about that moment when you discover these books that just fully envelop you. It was impossible for me not to drift toward specifically Through the Looking Glass, because that was a book that had captivated me when I was that age. And so it was just a natural thing to start drawing in allusions and references to Carol's works, among others.
You have said that you love children's literature because the created world and cultural issues, you can consider both. There's a bit of everything there. What's at stake here in this particular book, Sophie Quire?
Well, Sophie Quire and The Last Storyguard is the story about this 12-year-old bookmender who is living in a city called Busselburg. And Busselburg is a city that has basically turned its backs on stories. The book takes place in that sort of moment in history where sort of notions of kind of magic and mysticism and superstition were giving way to modernity. We're giving way to the Enlightenment and to rational thinking. And in the case of this town that Sophie lives in, they've decided that in order to get rid of that bathwater, they also must chuck out all the babies. And specifically, they enact something called a no-nonsense law. And this is for everyone in the town to basically take anything that feels silly or frivolous or useless or childish, and they're going to collect it in an enormous bonfire that they're going to burn. And primarily what this includes are storybooks, picture books, nursery rhymes, fairy tales, the things that they grew up with that now feel childish and silly and like nonsense. And everyone in the town is celebrating this change, this sign that they're marching into a bold, new, rational future, except for Sophie, this 12-year-old girl who loves these stories and is heartbroken to see them discarded. And so every morning she sneaks out to this giant pile where they're collecting these books to burn, and she steals them back and repairs them. And as she repairs them, she's reading them and falling deeply under the spell of these stories, because to her, these aren't just stories, they're her whole world. The characters inside are like living, breathing people to her. And for me, as someone who loves stories, has always loved stories, I'm sort of plagued by a question, and the question became only more urgent when I started writing books for kids and talking to kids about stories. It's very easy to make kind of thin platitudes or pandering platitudes about, like, reading is great, books are important. But every time I say that, there's always a voice in the back of my mind that asks, are they really? Because books are, in a way, they're inconsequential, they're insubstantial. You know, they don't feed an empty belly, they don't suture a wound. And yet, I know, and I think you know, that when the right reader finds the right story, something almost mystical transpires between them, and that reader emerges
Yeah.
truly transformed. And I wanted to write a story that took seriously the question of what is the point of a story. And it turned out to be an incredibly difficult question. And I lost my way while writing it several times. And eventually, the only way I could get through that question was actually to stand it on its head and ask the opposite question, which is, what do we lose when we turn our backs on stories? And and then the question became much more clear to me.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point because I think stories, they really are capsules of our humanity. They remind us of who we are. They remind us of who we're coming from and what we can be. And when you lose that, you lose everything. Jonathan, as I've read your books over many years, I see an influence of G.K. Chesterton in some of your work. How influenced are you by him before I get to the next rapid-fire questions?
I'm hugely influenced by Chesterton. Actually, the inscription in the beginning of my first book, Peter Nimble and His Fantastic Eyes, is taken from the poem that Chesterton put in the front of Man Who Was Thursday. And when I was writing both my first book, Peter Nimble, and the companion book, Sophie Choir, in many ways, I was trying to channel some kind of weird fusion between Chesterton and Samuel Johnson. I don't know if I was successful, but those were sort of my two touchstones in terms of voice and point of view. Yeah, so he was a huge figure in my reading.
Yeah, you see the shadow of Chesterton there, and it's a happy shadow, I'll say. I want to send some rapid-fire questions your way. I ask these of every author on the show. Your favorite children's book and your least favorite?
Oh boy, that is very difficult. I have a lot of favorites. One of the books that I come back to just over and over and over again is Treasure Island. It's not to say that this book is underrated, but in some ways, I think this book cannot be overrated. It's just such a wonderful adventure story, and I've read it so many times, and the ways that it's influenced my writing and my storytelling, I'm continually surprised by the influence that it's had in my writing in earlier days and even into the present. So that's a book that I can't get enough of. A book that I didn't like. I want to think carefully about this because I you know what? I have to be honest and say, and as odd as this is, because I talked about my love for Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, as I read those books over years, I started to feel very differently about the two volumes. They are two separate books. There were several years between the publication of the first Alice book and the second, and over years, I started to develop a very strong preference for the second book, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And that preference basically started to make me turn my back on the original Alice in Wonderland, which is sacrilege, I understand. Please do not send hate mail. But to this day, even though this book was hugely pivotal, and I've probably read it over 100 times, I'm pretty over it now.
Well, the Lewis Carroll estate won't be complaining. You're okay. Tell me about the story that changed your path, and what was the lesson that you extracted from that work?
Boy, that is a difficult question, as I'm sure you know, because so many stories can change people in so many different ways at different points in your life. I will say one of the books that really made a huge impact on me was a book called, I don't know if you felt this, but I studied English in undergraduate. And everyone I know who was ever an English major, they get so caught up in their readings for the papers they're writing and all of these things that they don't actually get to do any leisure reading. And many people who were English majors that I talked to, always after graduating, they have all this pent-up desire to just read a book for pleasure. And often the first book they read, that first summer after graduation, is absolutely life-changing. I remember my wife, when I first met her, she talked about that exact season she read East of Eden for the first time, and she just adored it. And it's been a hugely influential book in her life and the way she looks at the world because of that perfect moment. And I remember when I came out of undergrad, I was educated in Canada, so I had a good appetite of Canadian literature. And there was one Canadian author, a great Canadian author, that I had not read yet. And I remember, and I'm very grateful that I did, I just by chance picked up a book called Fifth Business by Robertson Davies. And that was one of those books. That was that first leisure book I read, and it was so much more than a beach read. It is a fantastic and complicated story about a man basically surveying his entire lifetime as he's grown up around these people who have had fantastical, outsized adventures in lives, and he's been a quieter person sort of in the middle of all that tumult. And I can't tell you exactly what it was about that book, but there was something about the way Robertson Davies was able to incorporate his background in theater, his deep biblical knowledge and sense for kind of biblical mythology, his good, solid Canadian common sense, his academic mind, all into one absolutely perplexing hero. And I remember just being floored that a book could feel like a living person the way that did.
Jonathan, before I let you go, very quickly, where do you write and why? 1 minute.
1 minute. I usually write, we just had a third baby, which means 3 babies in a row. I've been kicked out of my office or into smaller spaces. So finally, I'm renting an office outside of the house in Pittsburgh. So I write at a place, it's actually called the Beauty Shop. It's an open office space in an old beauty shop that they've restored. So I write there every single day for about 6 hours a day.
Excellent. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. Sophie Choir and the Last Story Guard by Jonathan Auxier is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. Jonathan, I hope you'll come back.
I hope to talk to you soon.